afternoon, everybody. This is Sandra and Sarah from Social Finance. I'll hand you over to Sandra shortly, but just a little bit of housekeeping. Sandra will be going through the presentation, and at the end of every section we'll address some questions. If you could submit your questions through your question panel throughout the webinar, she will get to them. She'll also do a complete question and answer session at the end of the presentation, so don't worry if she hasn't got to you straight away. And thank you for joining us. I'll hand you over to Sandra now.
Great. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I hope you're having a great day. As Sarah mentioned, please submit your questions throughout this webinar presentation, and I will pick up on them as we go through the slides. I'm unfortunately not able to hear you at all, so let's communicate via the Q&A format that you should see on your screen. Okay, so let's get started. The webinar will give an overview on the ways to conduct financial modeling of social impact bonds. I'm first going to give you an introduction into what a social impact bond is and how they're structured, and then we're going to go into the more technical and detailed overview of how to create a financial model. If throughout the presentation something is not clear, please do ask the question. So what is a social impact bond? So social impact bonds, it's not really a bond in a financial sense, but it is a structure it's a financial structure that has been created to invest in preventative services to improve social outcomes. The reason why it's not exactly a bond is because investors take equity-type risk to receive debt-like returns. However, there's been some innovation around the way that the returns are structured, which has reduced some of the risk. And I'll go into a couple of these examples later, but I just wanted to highlight this before we dive in. So the way it works is that public sector commissioners commit to pay for improved social outcomes for a particular target population up front. The commissioners can be anyone from, in the UK, the local government, or in the case of development impact bonds, for example, it can be a DFI, development finance institution, for example, the World Bank. Those haven't been developed yet, but traditionally commissioners have been the government, but it really can be anybody who is interested in achieving the outcomes that a social impact bond is aimed to address. So on the back of this contract that's commissioned with a party that's interested in achieving the outcomes, investment is raised from social investors to fund the intervention. They don't necessarily need to be social investors, but so far that's what we have. Those are the kind of investors that have been attracted to a social impact bond because of the impact that is associated with it, as well as the high risk of this structure. The investment is used to provide working capital for intervention services. A social impact bond will measure so the social outcomes are measured over time while the social impact bond is running and after it stops running, depending on how it's structured. And investors are repaid only if desired outcomes are achieved. So they risk losing their money if the intervention does not deliver the desired outcomes. The greater the improvement in outcomes, the greater the financial return to investors. So therefore, financial returns are very closely tied to the social impact. The next slide, this slide outlines why a local commissioner is interested in embarking on a social impact bond. I know that we have some participants who aren't in the UK, but this I will talk through this from a UK perspective. So, and a lot of these are actually relevant for commissioners across the board, regardless of which country they're in. So the first thing on the list is innovation. Innovation enables a commissioner to try out an innovative intervention without taking financial risk. So by trying a new intervention that doesn't fit with existing funding buckets, and a commissioner only has to pay for it if it succeeds. So for example, if a social impact bond is launched, then the intervention is funded by the investors up front. The commissioner doesn't have to pay anything until the outcomes have been met. The second thing on the list is flexibility. So social impact bond offers flexibility of how a program is delivered, and it will allow services to respond to individual needs as well as real-time learning about what works. So what this means is that if outcomes are predefined earlier on, the intervention doesn't have to be prescriptive. It's really important to know what kind of services will be provided through the social impact bond to achieve the desired outcomes, but they can be adjusted throughout throughout the life of the SIB, and that's really, and by SIB I mean social impact bond, and that's really what's at the heart of the social impact bond as well. Is a lot of times it's an innovative pilot way of testing what works and what doesn't work. So because a lot of the data and the outcomes are tracked throughout the social impact bond, one is really able to see what interventions are closely tied to the outcomes. So there's a lot of flexibility associated with SIB interventions. Another benefit is early intervention and prevention. Social impact bonds enable new upfront funding that helps shift resources and services to earlier indicators of need. So for example, in the case of the Essex social impact bond, the intervention aims to reduce the number of adolescents who go into care before they actually go into care. So this both saves money to Essex, as well as provides a way to address the issue at an earlier stage before it escalates. And the last thing on this list is social investment. So what this is trying to say is that through a social impact bond, new partnerships are created. So commissioners, social investors, and service delivery bodies, so charities, for example, all sit around the same table, and they discuss how to best structure an intervention that will create outcomes. In some cases, the intervention is already shaped before investors come in, but in other cases, investors, some of the more active social investors, like to be involved in structuring the intervention and defining the outcomes that will be tracked earlier on. So it's really a great opportunity to get different people on board, and we think that this way it actually creates better outcomes as well, because there are benefits to having different people who care about the same issue come together. So some on this slide also, there's some of these benefits that I've gone through are highlighted in the Essex example. So the Essex Social Impact Bond was structured through a 5-year intervention that worked with 380 adolescents and their families to reduce the number of adolescents who go into care. The Social Impact Bond enabled Essex to have a targeted investment into an area that was causing them the most difficulty, and through intervening at the earliest stage possible. And for the charity that was involved in this, Action for Children, the benefit was that it provided longer-term funding. So it provided 5-year funding for the charity, and a lot of the times charities are not able to secure funding for that long. So that was a great thing from their perspective. On the next slide, this slide goes into a little bit more detail on and provides an overview of the process of developing a social impact bond model. So the boxes that are in purple color are sort of the areas that need to be defined outside of the financial model, and then the areas that are in brown or yellow, the boxes that are in brown or yellow are the areas that need to feed into the model directly. So I'll go through these really quickly. So first, a commissioner needs to assess the service area that they would like to reshape, and the specific sector that they would like to work in. And then they need to define the social issues, including the target population that they want to work with. And the target population definition needs to be very specific. So, for example, it has to be very clear what the eligibility criteria is, who exactly will be entering the service. It doesn't necessarily need to be at the level of what age the individuals are, maybe not even what gender they are, but it needs to be very clear who the individuals are who will be eligible for the service and what outcomes will be tracked. So the next thing, the third box here says define outcomes metrics and define interventions. So at this stage, the commissioners or whoever is structuring the social impact bond needs to define what outcomes do they want to achieve and what interventions could improve these outcomes. Also, there needs to be a lot of specificity around how much, what is the reduction, or what outcomes are they looking to achieve. So, for example, a 10% reduction in reoffending is a very specific outcome. So, and also it's really important to outline what outcomes will be tracked and measured. So there are some outcomes that are more long-term, and then there are others that are more short-term. But a social impact bond on average runs for about 5 years, and a lot of data is tracked throughout. So the outcomes that the payments to the investors will be made on need to be tracked and measured throughout the social impact bond, and they need to be very specific. The next box is the value for money case. So this is the stage at which social impact bond is developed. Once you have the target population and intervention, you can start to calculate the cost of the social impact bond. So, for example, if you're aiming to reduce drug-related offending in London, you will define what specific interventions you'd like to use and how much these interventions will cost. You will know how many individuals will be entering the service and for how long. So this would give you the 5-year cost. If the intervention runs for 5 years, it will give you the 5-year cost of running the social impact bond. On top of the intervention cost, there's some other costs that should be added, so that are related to fund management, etc. But those are secondary. So I will not focus on that too much. So once you have the cost of the target of the intervention and the social impact bond, you can compare this cost to to the cost of this population to the public services currently, and how much would be saved with this intervention. So if you look at the drug-using population in London, there are certain costs that that public services are incurring as a result of this, as a result of things that this population does. So every time somebody gets arrested, there are costs associated with that. So a lot of these costs need to be understood in order to make the value for money case. So in order to calculate the value for money case to the commissioner, you would need to compare potential savings to the two public services to intervention costs. It's not, most of the time it's not the case that the commissioner who's commissioning the SIB is able to achieve 100% savings. So a lot of the times the costs to public services are scattered across different agencies. So once this has been outlined, this is a stage at which you will probably have a very good draft of a financial model. After this is done, the next stage would be to specifically design the program with the bearing in mind the service delivery bodies who will be providing the intervention, and then to procure the social impact bond, and then to contract the social impact bond. But the financial model really needs to be done before the last three stages on the slide. Okay, so at this stage I will check to see if there are any questions that have been asked. If you have any questions at this stage, please feel free to submit them now. Jan Campbell asked whether the slides will be sent to participants. The answer is yes. I believe they have been sent before. Oh, they will be, apologies, they will be emailed around after the webinar to all of the participants. Ryan Irwin asks, does the total contract value just relate to the service costs, i.e. implementation costs, or include the potential savings? So the total contract, the contract with the commissioner relates to how much they will be paying for each positive outcome, how much they will be paying for the outcomes that are predetermined. The amount of capital that needs to be raised from investors up front, so in year 1 or year 0, is the amount of money that's required to run the social impact bond. Most of that, between 80 to 90%, will go towards the servicing the intervention, so paying the service delivery bodies, which in most cases are charities. The rest of that, between 10 to 20%, will be used to cover some of the fundraising costs, as well as data collection and some of the more operating costs of the social impact bond itself. I hope that answers the question, but if there are any other aspects that I haven't covered, please feel free to ask. I will now move on to the next section, and then I will stop again at the end of next section to pick up questions. Okay, so I briefly touched on the value for money case earlier. The reason why it's important to look at this is because a lot of the commissioners that contract a social impact bond, they care about the savings that they could achieve as a result of this. This is a simplified way of looking at how public services could achieve savings from a social impact bond. So if you look at the first column on this chart, it includes the sort of the status quo. Most of the, and again, this is from a UK perspective, so I'm not sure if this exactly reflects if this reflects the case in other countries as well. But the way it is currently is that most of the government spend is reactive, and very little of it is preventative. So the idea of the social impact bond is that it takes some of this reactive spend by the government and converts it into preventative spend in order to achieve better outcomes. The way that's done is that, yes, the commissioner, the government doesn't pay for the intervention up front, but they do have to earmark some of the funds to pay for the outcomes of the social impact bond if they're met a couple of years down the line. So they do have to commit some of this funding on their end. So yeah, so the second column shows what happens in the case of with this social impact bond financed intervention. If it is successful, some of the money that the government will have to pay for the outcomes could come from the savings that they will achieve. So if there are public savings from reducing the number of individuals, the number of drug-related crime in London, for example, if there are public savings from that the commissioner could quantify and could achieve, then some of the argument could be made that some of these savings will be used then to fund the outcome payments at the end of the social impact bond intervention. I know this can be, it can be a bit complex because there are a lot of moving parts in here, so please feel free to ask if you need further clarification on this slide. But I'm going to move on in the interest of time. So on this slide, this slide outlines some of the key aspects of the financial model. Key inputs into the model would include some of the things that we've outlined on the slide that had the steps to developing a social impact bond. So the key inputs include the current cost to the government for a particular target population. That goes back to the public savings point. The cost of a proposed SIB intervention. So one would need to understand specifically who the target population is and what the intervention is and how much does the intervention cost in order to estimate this. Then the estimated impact of the proposed intervention in the form of outcome metrics. And finally, the potential cost savings to commissioners as a result of the intervention. Then the key outputs of the model are the savings case, so it goes back to the value for money point. Are the intervention costs less than the cost savings? What is the investment required? How much needs to be raised from investors, and how much needs to come from the government in the form of outcomes payments? And then finally, an estimate of returns to investors. Now this one is interesting because this can be both an input and an output of the model depending on how it's structured. Most of the time it is the estimated return to investors is an output of the model of all of the of all of the other inputs that, that I've highlighted. But in some cases, it can be an input into the model, and then you can do, as a result of, or based on, depending on what returns investors require for a given social impact bond, that will determine how big the outcomes payments need to be from the commissioner. So you can use the investor return either as an input or an output, depending on the dynamics of the parties involved in the social impact bond. The key things for investors is that they will clearly need to understand how much money is needed to fund the social impact bond, and when they will get paid, and how likely it is that they will get paid back, all of which is tied to the outcomes, and when the outcomes payments would be coming in if outcomes are achieved. This slide just highlights the investment raising process. Again, as I've highlighted earlier, a social impact bond has equity type risk because investors could lose all of their investments if outcomes are not achieved. So a lot of times when investors do due diligence, they're really focused on understanding how likely it is that this intervention will achieve the predetermined outcomes. In some cases, as I mentioned earlier, the risk, well, the structure of the social impact bond has been slightly adjusted so that the risk is reduced. So, for example, in the case of the social impact bond that was the first one that was launched in the United States that Goldman Sachs invested in, that social impact bond, the losses are partially guaranteed by the Bloomberg Foundation. So in this case, the investor doesn't take the risk that other investors who put in money in SIBs have taken, because their principal wouldn't be completely wiped out if the outcomes aren't met. Again, it's very the investment raising process really differs depending on the social impact bond. In some cases, investors look at a product that's been structured and is ready to go. In other cases, investors are involved in earlier on in the process, and they're involved in structuring the social impact bond. So it really depends on how active the social investor is. I mean, most of the investors who are involved in structuring the social impact bond earlier on are social investors, and they're the ones who really, really care about making sure that the outcomes are achieving the social impact that they've been set out to do. This slide highlights a really important issue, which is the time frame of the social impact bond. Investors, they prefer to see a social impact bond that matures within around 5 years. Anything shorter than that, there have been some SIBs that have been launched to last for 3 years, but in most cases, their social impact bonds they run for about 5 years. But because investors care about getting their outcome payments quickly, there needs to be a very tight time scale between the intervention measurement of impact and payment of outcomes achieved. The earlier the commissioner is able to pay money back to investors, the lower the cost of capital investors will require. So if in some instances, so for example, if the measurement part is done after, if the social impact bond runs for 5 years, and after each year outcomes are tracked and measured, and investors could get some of the outcome payments before the social impact bond has wrapped up. So in this case, they can recycle the payments into paying some of the future costs of the intervention. This reduces the upfront capital requirement and as well as the cost of capital. So in some cases, this is a more efficient way to use money that's raised from investors upfront. So for example, in the Essex SIB, the time frame over which outcomes are measured is very compact. Outcome payments begin 3 months after the first group of adolescents have completed the intervention, in this case the MST course. And these payments are distributed early and immediately so that the program is cost efficient for Essex. And it allows the social impact bond and the investors to recycle the capital that they receive from the commissioner back into the social impact bond to fund future interventions. Another example to highlight is that in early years intervention, so for example for children ages between 1 and 5, if the outcome metric is educational attainment, but it's necessary to wait a decade to measure GCSE results for the target population, this is not likely to make a feasible SIB because a decade is a very long time to wait to measure outcomes and to receive outcome payments. There are very few investors, if any, who would want to wait for that long. One way that this could be addressed is through intermediate or proxy outcomes that are available against which payments can be made. So there are ways to structure around this to assure that the intervention outcome is being tracked in the short term. So I wanted to run you through some examples of approach. It's a lot of the SIBs are built around the same principles, but the details are very different depending on what the social impact bond is, who is investing in it, and who the commissioners are. So in terms of the use of funding that's raised from investors up front, most of the time investors will fund the working capital of the social impact bond, and if outcomes are met, commissioners pay a pre-agreed amount that is used to pay back investors. But as I mentioned, in the Essex SIB, payments begin within 9 months after services commence, and this early cash flow that's received by investors is recycled back into the service delivery. In terms of the returns to the investors, investor returns are tied to the performance of the social impact bond intervention, and they may be capped. So most of the time they vary depending on the level of outcomes that are achieved, but they can be capped so that they're not too high for the commissioner to pay them out. So usually it's within a kind of a preset ceiling limit. And then in terms of the returns to investors, another thing to highlight is that in some cases the interest the interest rate or the return provided to investors has been fixed. This is usually not the case because the amount of money that investors receive is very closely tied to the outcomes. But in one case, in the case of the Baker, the CVAA adoption social impact bond that's been structured by Baker Tilly, the interest rate that's paid out to investors is fixed annually. So there are different models, there are different ways of structuring them depending on what the goals are. And then the last thing is the intervention and contract specifications. So as I mentioned earlier, the commissioners can develop the final service spec on their own and then launch a social impact bond and try to capital raise for it, or they can do that alongside with investors who are interested in putting in money towards a specific social issue area. I'm going to take a quick break now to read the questions and to answer any questions you may have. So please use your screens to ask anything that is not clear that you would like to know more about. Okay, so the first question, Jan Campbell asked, can a provider lead on the development of a social impact bond? The answer is yes, the provider could lead on development of a social impact bond, but however, the provider would have to identify the commissioners that would value the outcomes of that particular intervention. In the case of the Commissioning Better Outcomes Fund that's available, providers can apply, but it's highly encouraged that they apply alongside of a commissioner. And the reason for this is really that it's really a practical reason. So if there's a clear commissioner who values the outcomes of the intervention, it will be much easier to to launch the social impact bond and to raise capital against it, because investors do look for they value commissioner being involved or being identified at the early stage of the process. The next question is, sorry, just 1 second, please. The next question is from Fred B. How do you evaluate the amount payback to investors? For example, for the Peterborough SIB, the interest rate is between 7 and 13%. Which criteria are used at the end of the project to determine the exact amount? So in the case of Peterborough, the outcome payments are based on the success of the intervention, which in Peterborough is reduction of recidivism for that particular population that's using the services. So all of this is pre-agreed up front before capital is raised. It's all pre-agreed with the commissioners. It should all come out of the model. And this goes back to the point that I talked through earlier about, in some cases you can actually use your the investor returns as an input. So for example, if you put into your model that you want the investors to achieve a 7% return at a 10% reduction of recidivism, then that should tell you how big the outcome payments need to be for each individual who does not reoffend. I hope that makes sense. So it can be, the returns can either be an output or an input into your model. Now, what actually happens on the ground is that once social impact bond's up and running, all of the metrics are tracked, and then they're evaluated at the end at the predetermined measurement period. When they're evaluated, you would know, so in the Peterborough case, you would know how many individuals did not reoffend, and as a result, what the reduction is in recidivism, and that will tell you how much what the outcome payments will be in total, because there's an amount that's associated with every single person that does not reoffend, and that's already pre-agreed. So at the end, that's kind of the easy part. It's just an easy calculation. But what's really difficult is tracking these individuals and being able to compare them against a control group to say that the reduction in recidivism has actually happened as a result of the intervention and not an external factor. Okay, I've just gotten a couple of more questions, so I'm going to take another half a minute to look through them. Henrik Storm asks, what do you think of the prospects for social impact bonds with shorter durations than 3 years? For example, where the production or consumption of or services drive near-term social impact? The answer to this, it really depends on the intervention and the outcomes that you're trying to achieve. We think that social impact bonds need to be structured to provide intervention for at least a couple of years, because a lot of the social impact bonds are pilot programs, and they're innovative programs that haven't been tested before, and a lot of them use this. The first year or two is usually used to collect information and to increase knowledge of what works and what doesn't. And so we think that if it lasts for a couple of years, that really maximizes the potential to create social impact and longer-term outcomes, because it gives the service provider an opportunity to adjust the intervention if some things works, and to make changes. So I think that, but I think from an investor perspective, that could be more attractive because investors care about getting their money earlier. So it really depends on the intervention and how well established it is. I think if there's a clear idea that has been tested before, that would benefit from a short-term, where the population would benefit from a short-term intervention, where that's really clear, I think it could work. But again, the devil is in the details, and it really depends on what the social impact bond is trying to achieve. Another question from Fred B. At the end of a SIB, the goal is for the investor to reinvest or for the government to develop the project. The goal for launching a social impact bond is different for each stakeholder that's involved. For the government, as I've outlined earlier, it really a social impact bond can provide a way for them to implement a new and innovative service without taking a financial risk, because they don't fund anything up front unless that intervention works. So that's sort of the main one of the main benefits for the commissioner or the government. And in a lot of cases, there are cost savings that can be achieved by focusing on more preventative rather than reactive services, as we've seen in the case of the Essex social impact bond. For the investors, a lot of the investors that have been actively involved in social impact bonds so far have been social investors. So a lot of them care about the mission as much as the financial returns. In the Peterborough social impact bond, which was the first one that was ever launched, most of the investors were foundations and high net worth individuals, and there were no commercial investors. And the reason for this is that it was a new structure. It's highly risky, and but it provided potentially a way to fund a lot of social interventions and create more social impact. So that was sort of the profile of the investors. So your question about, Fred, about what the goal is for the investor, whether it's to reinvest the money or for the government to develop the project, it really depends on the investor. I think in the case of Goldman Sachs, they have a very different they have very different goals than, for example, Bridges in the UK does, or another social investor in the UK. They actually, from what I understand, they invested into the social impact bond out of their sort of investment pot. But I think that they care just as much about the returns as some of the social investors may. So it really, and if it's successful, they can use these returns to reinvest in another social impact bond. So that's kind of that's the benefit. The benefit of investing money as a social investor or a commercial investor into something that creates impact is that it comes back and it can be reinvested again for another social and environmental cause. Okay, so I hope that answers most of your questions. I'm going to move on to the last section since we're running out of time, and I will take a couple of more questions at the end. So this slide outlines the big lottery and cabinet office funds that are available to support SIB development. They have been recently set up, and it's brilliant that these funds are available because they can really make a difference in terms of how quickly a SIB can be launched. Just as an FYI, this is only available for those commissioners that are in the United Kingdom. So what do the funds? I'm going to run through this really quickly, but do let me know if you have any questions. So what do the funds cover? They provide a top-up to commissioners' outcomes payments, an average of 20%, up to 40% of outcome payments are covered. So, for example, if a commissioner wants to embark on a new social impact bond, but they're not able to cover all of the outcomes payments, or they don't see that value for money case and the cost savings accruing to them, but they see it accruing to other agencies that don't necessarily want to participate, this is a great way to get that additional funding into the outcomes payments. The funds also provide funding for developing a social impact bond. So commissioners can purchase technical support to develop their SIB ideas. And the development funding that's available is between £10,000 and £150,000. At the bottom of the slide, you'll see that there's a two-stage application process. There's a single application form for both of the funds. And you can find additional information on the website that's provided on this slide. So what are the funds looking for? Each fund has its own mission, which is outlined on this page. But to make the application process easier, as I mentioned, there is a single point of entry, so you only apply once. Once you apply, the application is reviewed by one committee that determines whether and how much comes from each fund. And as I mentioned earlier, service providers can apply individually, but it is highly recommended that they do so with a commissioner because it's more practical and it will result in a social impact bond getting launched more quickly. This slide summarizes what is involved in an expression of interest. So these are the key things that commissioners will need to provide in the application. They will have to think about what is the social issue that they want to address, what outcomes they want to improve, and how these outcomes will be tracked and measured. what savings can be made, and who will they accrue to, what intervention program may address a social issue, are there potential providers that they have identified or worked with in the past. So even if a commissioner applies for this the funds, they will have to have an idea of what the intervention looks like and who potential providers are. So this may be a good opportunity for service providers to partner up with commissioners. And then finally, the last question is, why is this proposal attractive to investors? It's not required that the applicants have conversations with investors, but it's helpful to understand why they think it's an attractive proposition. At the bottom of this page, you'll see that the link to download the expression of interest is provided on the Big Lottery Fund's website. If you have any questions or need support to complete an expression of interest, feel free to email us. That's at the bottom of this page as well. And then this slide just summarizes the several strands of work that social finance is doing to provide support to apply to these funds. And you can read more about that on our website. So thank you very much. I hope this was helpful. I'm going to take another look at the questions right now, so do feel free to post any last-minute questions that you may have. Okay, we have one last question. It's from Justin Bertignoli. I hope I pronounced your last name correctly. It asks, for the financial case payout from commissioners, how advisable is it to build a case that partners federal, country, and regional county commissioners together, as many programs see benefits to multiple levels of government? This is a really this is a really important question, and this is one of the reasons that the funds have been created, because a lot of the potential public sector savings accrue to different commissioners, who not all of whom may be interested in funding the outcome payments for a particular social impact bond. So in terms of the financial case, I think that it strengthens if commissioners who accrue the saving benefits from a social impact bond work together. It's better for everybody involved, and it improves. I think it improves both the quality of the intervention, because several parties come to the same table to outline what the intervention is and what the outcomes are. But it also creates a better case for launching the social impact bond. So it is highly advisable to build a case with the commissioners that accrue benefits from the social impact bond outcome savings. And this is something that the funds care about as well. So if a commissioner applies to a fund and can identify other commissioners that will get benefits from the SIB, it's highly advisable that they list that in the application as well. But even if they're not able to partner with another commissioner, I think it's helpful to know who the savings accrue to. Okay, so I hope that answers all of your questions. My colleague Sarah Henderson will email you the slides of the webinar as well as my contact information. So feel free to reach out to either of us if you have any questions or would like any further clarification on what we've covered today. Thank you very much, everyone. Take care.